And we are following breaking news here on HQ this afternoon out of the Pac-12, where Washington coach Chris Petersen stepping down unexpectedly has taken the coaching world by storm. Petersen will transition to a leadership role at the school after the Huskies bowl game. Defensive coordinator Jimmy Lake will take over as their head coach. Take a look at this, though. Some of the numbers there for Chris Petersen. Second in active coaches with the highest winning percentage, ahead of Nick Saban. So why is he stepping down? For more on that, let's bring in our college football writer, Barrett Salles. So, Barrett, this was very unexpected to many of us. What is your initial reaction upon hearing this news?
Shocked. I mean, the coaching carousel always spins out of control, but this is not one that any of us expected. And then, you know, Chris Petersen's a guy who had been rumored for a bunch of other jobs a long time ago, and it stopped because it appeared that he settled in at Washington, and that's where he wanted to stay long term. And for him to bail, you know, after 6 seasons, that's a shock. He seemed to all of us like he was going to be one of those coaches that just hangs out at his school for 10, 15, 20 years. And the only word that comes to mind is shocked, because yes, Washington has declined lately since the playoff berth in 2016, but they're still a darn competitive football team, a very attractive school, a very attractive recruiting base with a wonderful location and a great fan following. So, yeah, it's a shock, no doubt.
Do you think this was a personal decision? I mean, he says he's retiring. He's going to stay at the school, you know, in an administrative role, those sorts of things. We saw Bob Stoop retire at the exact same time. Is there a possibility he could go on to coach, or do you think he really just wants to retire right now?
I think there's always a possibility, and with Bob Stoops, you know, it's still sort of fresh, and, you know, he was rumored for, and has been rumored for, jobs even this offseason. I go back to Urban Meyer. If you remember correctly, Urban Meyer retired in 2009 and then unretired 2 days later and came back to the Florida Gators for another year, and then retired again, and then came back to Ohio State, and then retired then, and now we don't know what he's doing. So the way the press release was written with the words recharge, that signals to me that he's going to coach again, whether that's in the NFL or whether that's in college, whether that's in the XFL, I don't know. But Bob Stoops is a good comparison because of age. But when he stepped down, I think it was abundantly clear, at least at that time, that he was out. Like, he's not going anywhere. This press release doesn't really seem to feel that way. So I don't know if there's something else in store. Obviously, Washington was expecting this. Otherwise, Jimmy Lake would not be named the head coach. This is those things like Ohio State last year, where Ryan Day was waiting in the wings that this was sort of orchestrated. But the way it's written, yeah, it feels like that he might be looking to go somewhere else at some point. I don't think it's going to be this year. It might not be next year. But certainly his phone will not stop ringing, because what he did at Boise State and what he did at Washington is going to earn him plenty of looks. Even if he is officially retired, people will still be bugging him.
So, Barrett, I have pure speculation here. If he gets this little recharge, any place you see him is a good fit, either in college football or the NFL.
Well, as of now, Clay Helton's sticking around for another year at USC, right? Well, what happens next year? Because Clay Helton might not be sticking around for 2 more years at USC. And here's a guy in Chris Petersen who, back in the day, was mentioned in connection with multiple coaching searches in Los Angeles. So I think if USC ever does open, then that would be a natural fit for him. A place like Notre Dame, if Brian Kelly ever decides to leave or go to the NFL, would certainly be a good place for him, because they do have to recruit in a different way, kind of like Washington does. So, yeah, I mean, I think, to me, he feels like a college coach. I can't see him dealing with NFL players. He seems more like he's relatable. He's more relatable to college kids. I would imagine that he sticks around college. And quite honestly, I don't know how desirable he would be to the NFL based on college coaches not necessarily succeeding at that level, especially ones who have succeeded at a high level at college. So I'd imagine if he goes somewhere else down the road, it would be an extremely high-profile college job.
So let's talk a little bit about Jimmy Lake here, their defensive coordinator, who now takes over as head coach and interim head coach as the official head coach. When we've talked a lot about comparing this to Bob Stoops, when he left Oklahoma, pretty much everybody at OU knew, hey, Lincoln Riley was our next guy. That's who they wanted, and they didn't want him to go somewhere else. What do we know about Jimmy Lake?
Same exact thing with Lincoln Riley. Same thing with Ryan Day last year at Ohio State. I mean, Jimmy Lake is a programmer. He understands everything around that. He's a Washington guy. He's familiar with how everything is supposed to operate, not just from an organizational standpoint, but also from a recruiting standpoint, which is important considering where they are and the fact that there are a lot of teams flying in to Seattle to try to steal some players out of there. So the fact that continuity exists, even though the head coach changes, that's really important because staff continuity, whether it just be with assistants or with head coaches, is so important because those players in college, they're only there for a short period of time. They need to hear the same voices over and over again in order to be successful at the highest level. So, yeah, I mean, he's a guy who turned Washington's defense into its strength, into its calling card, and for a place like Washington, that's what drove them to the playoff. It's what drove them to multiple Pac-12 titles. So, I don't know if he's ready for the job in terms of being up to snuff to be a head coach, but I think the toughest task for any first-time head coach is organization. And for him to be already in that program, then he already knows the way it needs to be organized. And I think that's an enormous first step for him.
All right, Barrett Salles, thank you so much for joining us here on the Breaking News. Chris Petersen stepping down at Washington.
Now look at the schedule there. They started the season ranked 13th in the country and finished 7-5 and a losing record in the Pac-12. A really disappointing season for the Washington Huskies. For more on Chris Petersen stepping down at Washington, we bring in Chip Patterson from the Pick Six podcast. Chip, your initial reaction to this stunner today?
I think that Chris Petersen
Cover
is
3
probably
podcast.
recognizing
I saw your head
that
move there. Oh, sorry.
Hey, so
there's a lot of podcasts here.
I understand. We've got a wonderful network, and Pick Six is great for the NFL, but when you want the college, you come to the Cover 3 because nobody else has that blanket bracket coverage. Here's what we got with Chris Petersen. We've got a legendary coach in college football that throughout his time, one of the winningest coaches in the sports history, and I think that what he recognizes is that maybe he's lost his fastball, that maybe some of the same messaging that he's been using to build up his program throughout these years, that maybe it wasn't resonating with the team. And this is a coaching staff that thankfully does have an option in Jimmy Lake, a rising star, someone who now has an incredible opportunity to take over a program that does have good support, good resources, and sort of a good connection with the community there in Seattle. But Chris Petersen as an individual, I can't say that we've looked at Washington over the last couple of years and be like, man, that was his best coaching job. I think that when Chris Petersen holds himself to that high standard that comes with having that kind of winning percentage as a head coach, I think that you can take a look at things and you can recognize that maybe you aren't all that charged up for it. And Chris, I'm going to go back to an anecdote from a Pac-12 media days about 3 years ago where Chris Petersen really bemoaned a lot of the extra responsibilities that come with being a Power 5 coach in the modern era of college football. The media responsibilities, the ways that you need to go raise money and be a spokesperson for the program. I think that Chris Petersen is really somebody who just wants to go and coach ball. And if coaching ball wasn't even giving him the kind of satisfaction, the fact that he would, step away and hit recharge, there's nothing about Chris Petersen from my time covering him that leads me to believe he would want to stick around, wear out his welcome, and get run out of town. He just might recognize that it's not working. Because I will agree, last year they won the Pac-12, but they had to come roaring back after some disappointing losses in order to do so. This year, another disappointing finish. These last 2 years make it such that while I am surprised a coach of his age, his experience, and his overall success has stepped down, knowing the personality of Chris Petersen, I am not surprised that when he wasn't seeing results that meet his very, very high level of expectation, He's the first one to call it, and he's the first one to walk away.
And he uses the word recharge. He's going to recharge. And having said what you just did, Chip, about how he doesn't seem to enjoy all of the other stuff that goes along with being not a head coach, but in college football at that level, you're really a CEO, all the stuff that you have to do. Does that lead you to believe that if he does come back to coaching, he might want to look to the National Football League?
Perhaps. I think that as a great football coach, and I say that with like capital F football, I think that Chris Petersen would win state championships at the high school level. We've seen him compete at the highest level in college, and I do think that Chris Petersen, if that's something that he wants to do, could go and be successful in the NFL as well. He is just a capital F football mind that I think does a great job of teaching the game and developing talent. But, you know, the developing talent part of that is not something that you have as much in the NFL. And maybe some of the extra parts, you don't have to recruit in the NFL, but you do have to deal with the politics of a front office. And all that might be something that Chris Petersen's not all that interested in. There will be NFL opportunities because he's too good of a football coach. But him deciding to step down, him deciding to recharge, I do not anticipate that the next chapter of this story is him being introduced as the head coach of an NFL team for 2020.
Jimmy Lake, the defensive coordinator, taking over as head coach after the bowl game. Now, they've had some really good defenses there at Washington under Chris Petersen, and Lake has been a part of many of Chris Petersen's staffs. But how do you think this is going to go over with Husky fans who, you know, they were ecstatic when Petersen came, but are very disappointed with the way the last couple of seasons have gone?
I think that they're going to take a note from the school and support Jimmy Lake originally, but I do feel like this is a tricky spot for Jimmy Lake. And I think it's a tricky spot because his star power has caused Washington to restructure its coaching staff now twice. Remember, he got the promotion to co-defensive coordinator because other schools are trying to come and poach one of the rising stars in terms of the defensive side of the ball. Now he's also getting thrust in to this head coaching opportunity. And again, great opportunity, incredible resources. If Jimmy Lake proves to be the rising star in the industry that many people have thought and still think to this day, well, then Washington's a great vehicle for him to go and achieve that kind of success. But, you know, if this doesn't go very well, then Washington fans could get frustrated that the entire coaching staff has kind of been reworked around Jimmy Lake now a couple of times. You know, Pete Kwiatkowski taking a step back, at least in terms of the way the org chart is set up. And so Jimmy Lake's got to really prove it because, unfortunately, the one thing that is not his expertise, but he does have responsibility for, is that offensive side of the ball. And we've talked about it a lot on the Cover 3 podcast. I think that Washington's struggles on offense the last 2 years might be an indication that Jonathan Smith, who of course is now at Oregon State, really might have been the special sauce in getting that thing going with Jake Browning, Myles Gaskin, Dante Pettis, very, very good players on that Washington offense. But then to see Jacob Eason, Salvon Ahmed, Puka Nacua, like you still have good talent. They just haven't been able to be as successful. And I wonder if Jonathan Smith being gone is part of that. So Jimmy Lake, you have the support of the Washington fans because the Washington fans are going to take a note from the Washington program, which has done a lot to bend over backwards and give you the keys to this program. But if you cannot fix the offense, Washington will not be winning Pac-12 championships. So now, unfortunately, one of the rising stars on the defensive side of the ball has a responsibility to get things going with the Huskies offense.
I see.